And one thing I can tell you as a sheriff, I'm not going to get involved in politics except for law enforcement.
Yeah.
Why would anybody want to know what I think about things that I'm not trained in?
Right.
I know law enforcement. That's where I'm going to stay.
Yeah.
And I'm very big proponent on knowing your lane. My lane is law enforcement. Can I influence other offices? Yes, I can. But this is my lane. And it's just like other offices, the county commissioners or whatever, the auditor. They have their lane. They can influence my lane, but don't drive in my lane and I won't drive in your lane, right? So that's my thought about politics. The only reason I'm a politician is because the sheriff is the only elected law enforcement official in the world. And I got to tell you, with history, I love history, and the office of sheriff is so important to our country. Because you think about it, there is no other law enforcement official in the world that answers directly to the citizens who elected him. There's none. Every other law enforcement official answers to a politician that's not law enforcement. So I answer directly to the citizens, and that's what appealed to me about being a sheriff.
That's interesting. I never thought about it that way, but you're right, because even like a chief of police is basically appointed, and at any point, say a mayor can go, "You're out."
Yep.
You only have the citizens. Those are the only people that can get you out.
Yep. And I answer directly to them, and I hold that very near and dear to my heart. The Constitution of the United States is a big document that drives everything that we do, and the Constitution of Washington State drives a lot of that. And the power rests on the people. And law enforcement, just like preachers and doctors, we got too much power and authority to not be held accountable. We have to be held accountable, because if we weren't, it'll draw the wrong people. If you give people power with no accountability, the wrong people come to that profession.
Yeah.
Right? So I've never been one that's opposed to police accountability. I think it's a good thing. I think preachers should be held accountable too, and I think doctors, because they just got too much power if they're not held accountable. And the sheriff is directly accountable to the citizens. I don't have to worry about what a mayor thinks and what a city council thinks. I don't have to worry about what the governor, because the chief of state patrol could be fired tomorrow by the governor. I don't have to worry about, in federal agencies, what their elected official bosses think. I have to worry about what my citizens want and think, and what the laws and the Constitution say. And then I consider everybody else, because we're partners. Right? And
Yeah.
I can get a lot more done in partnership with everybody than in opposition. So I have to find that balance, but I answer to the citizen.
Interesting.
That's why I'm out in the community all the time.
Yeah.
My job is relationships and resources. My undersheriff runs the agency.
Okay, so for the audience, I'm going to start off the intro a little bit different today. I am here with Mason County Sheriff Ryan Spurling. He's the 41st sheriff ever elected in Mason County. And Ryan, can you tell me where Mason County is?
Absolutely. Mason County is just a little bit north of Olympia. We are surrounded by 1.3 million people of Kitsap County, Pierce County, Thurston County, and Jefferson County. So we're right at the base of the Olympics. We have the Hood Canal, the Puget Sound, 200 lakes, a national park, a national forest. It's a little mecca amongst all of the other craziness around us of populated areas.
Yes.
This is where everybody vacations and recreates.
So how far are you, for people, as far as an example, how far are you from Olympia and how far are you from Seattle?
Okay, Olympia is our capital, and we're 30 minutes from Olympia,
Okay.
Towards the mountains. From Seattle, we're a little over an hour.
Okay.
Depending on which way you go, I can even go into Bremerton and ride a ferry boat, the most beautiful thing ever, into Seattle.
Okay. How many deputies do you have?
We're running right at, total fully commissioned, we're around 50.
Okay.
So on the streets, 34, 35 deputies, and the rest have special assignments, including detectives.
Okay. What, how big is your area that your guys have to patrol?
We have 1,000 square miles. and only one incorporated city in those 1,000 square miles. So everything else is ours. We have 12 schools, or actually 13 schools that we're responsible for. We're the only county in the state that has 2 prisons. And we respond to emergencies out of those prisons, and we respond to crimes that occur in those prisons. We have, like I said, the National Park and National Forest, Hood Canal, Puget Sound, 200 lakes, a very diverse community as far as location, because I can be in Hoodsport, see a crash on the North Shore, and it's going to take me 45 minutes to get there because it's divided by water.
I got to ask, because I love it, what's the deal with the cowboy hat?
Absolutely. Cowboy hat, I've been wearing cowboy hats and had horses most of my life, but for me, it is the traditional hat of the office and the tradition of the American sheriff and the sheriff's office. As they came west, it was what kind of marked the sheriff as somebody different. You look back at some of the significant sheriffs in the history of our United States. That cowboy hat is associated with it. When I took office, we had the campaign hat as our primary duty uniform hat. And I went back to the traditional hat of the sheriff's office to honor some of those before, because it used to be our official hat.
Okay. Getting back to your kind of duties here in Mason County, what is the predominant crime, if you have one? What are you dealing with the most in Mason County?
I would say traditionally and even now, it's property crimes.
Okay.
Burglaries, that type of thing.
Okay. All right. So tell me a little bit about growing up. Where'd you grow up? What was your family life like? And was there anything growing up that led you to law enforcement?
I went to 13 different grade schools in Washington, Idaho, Montana, California, and Arizona. Because my mom got married and divorced a lot. And then I finally moved back in with my dad up here in Washington, who worked at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, where I was born, and went to one high school up here. And then at that point, joined the Marine Corps because I was out at the Naval Sub Base. I was around the Navy, and I didn't necessarily want to be in the Navy, but I saw the Marines guarding the gate, and they looked sharp and they looked tough, and I started looking into it. So they supposedly were the hardest to go through, so I'm like, I'm in. So I went in the Marine Corps. No, I did not have anything that drew me to be law enforcement that I was conscious of. I had been accepted to the University of Washington, and I was going to be either an attorney or a doctor. Those were my thoughts. And my dad had graduated from UW, and he said, well, you got to earn your way through. And I thought, I don't know what I want to take. I think I want to do these things, but I'm not real sure. I'm going to go in the Marine Corps. That sounds like a good challenge. And when I was getting out of the Marine Corps, I had a year left. My wife and I were, because I had been married, my wife and I got married. We were married at 19. We've been married for almost 40 years. She is an absolute saint to go through all these things with me. She's amazing. But so we came home on annual leave. I was stationed down in Arizona. I was in the Marine Corps working on Harriers, and came back home and had a year left. And we started talking about what are we going to do when we get out. And we're driving between Bremerton and Silverdale, and there's a wreck up in front of me in the median. And a trooper is standing there with his campaign hat investigating the wreck. And it was just one of those really, really bizarre things that happen in life. And I looked over at my wife and I said, that's what I'm going to do, and I don't know why. And
wow.
That's what I
just
did.
Just out of the blue.
I had no aspirations to be in law enforcement. But coming out of the Marine Corps, really, I worked on Harriers. I was a parachute rigger. You know, they give you a parachute when you're going through school and say jump with it. You know, those are the type of things you did. But I was a jarhead. I can do a lot of push-ups and shoot guns well. What am I going to do when I get out? That looks good.
Okay, so in 88, you basically begin your law enforcement career. You start with Washington State Patrol. How old are you?
I was 22.
22. So, holy mackerel. So when did you start with the Marines? How old were you then?
18.
18. Okay. So 22, you start with Washington State Patrol. Tell me about the process. Do you basically apply to them You go to their academy. What happens?
It was a long process. It was 6 months because I'd just gotten out of the Marine Corps. I was working for UPS, going to college full time because I'd gone to college before I joined the Marine Corps and decided to, because I was going to a junior college, I didn't end up going to UW. And while working for UPS, I applied for the State Patrol, and it took approximately 6 months to actually get hired. And it was also, I joined the Army Reserves because there was no good Marine Reserve program around, and I wanted to stay in the military and continue to serve that way. So I was recruited and brought into a drill sergeant unit with the 104th Training Division, and we were reserve drill sergeants, which I figured if I'm going to go to the Army from the Marine Corps, at least I'll be a drill sergeant, and that'll be a little bit more strack, a little bit more challenging, and stayed in the Army Reserves at the same time as the State Patrol.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about going through the academy when you're 22 years old. I mean, I'm assuming you've already been through the Marines, so anything they're going to throw at you is probably light compared to that.
Physically, it was light in that respect. At that time, it was before the Fair Labor Standard Acts influenced how much you can train people in the academy. We got up at 5:30 in the morning. I mean, it was, uphill both ways for the old guys, right? We got up at 5:30 in the morning and sometimes went until 10 o'clock at night. We did 1,400 hours, 12 to 1,400 hours worth of training in a little over 14 weeks. We were 6 days a week. I loved it. It was a very easy transition for me. There was a lot of people that were coming from college that really wrestled with it, whereas I'm like, come on, well, this is nothing. But academically, it challenged me. It challenged me greatly in the academic area because I'd gone to junior college, but I'd never gone to a university and had to write the reports. I didn't know anything about courts. I didn't know the difference between district court and superior court. I really didn't. So I had a lot to learn.
Yeah. Okay. So you graduate from the WSP Academy, and I've talked to other troopers. So for the audience that have watched or listened to some of my other interviews, can you explain how it works with Washington State Patrol in terms of once you graduate, how do you get assigned to a specific area, or how does that work?
Yeah, at the time when I went through, you got hired first as a cadet, and you had to you applied for the position, you went and worked as a cadet, and then you actually applied for the academy. And you had to do ride hours. And back then, I would ride Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 8 hours after I did an 8-hour shift. So I would ride every night, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, because I knew that you had to be competitive to even get into the academy. And I was the youngest in the academy because some of the guys that I went through the academy with had 2 years already with the State Patrol, and I had only had a few months, so I'd had 300 hours of ride time. Then I went to the academy, stayed there, graduated. But before you graduate in the State Patrol, it's a little different than the Criminal Justice Training Center here in Washington State. In the State Patrol, you do your FTO or your coaching before you graduate.
Oh.
So I went from the academy to Chehalis for 6 weeks and worked the streets down in Chehalis, Centralia, all the way up to Morton for the FTO, then came back and graduated. And then I had a wish list and I got what I had asked for. I asked for the Everett area, and I ended up going right out of the academy over to Everett area and worked up there for a year and a half, but I'd put in for a request to Eastern Washington because I wanted to live in Eastern Washington.
Okay, so let's start with Everett. So for the audience, Everett is just north of Seattle, I don't know, 45 minutes or so. What's your area of responsibility when you get to the Everett area? How big is your area?
It was actually a pretty small area because we were in South Everett and we're responsible for I-5 and 405 and all the state routes in the just north of King County, which is the county that Seattle's in. Snohomish County is next to it. And we had everything from King County up to the middle of the county. So it was very busy. It was very, very traffic oriented. I can still remember the last day I worked in Everett. It was kind of mine. Here's the tall finger to all of those busy days on the freeways. I had a 9-car injury accident at 405 and I-5. So this is rush hour. I've got 5 people on one side of 5 lanes, 4 people on the other side of 5 lanes. I have 3 people taken to hospitals. They were all 3 different hospitals, one to Everett General, one to Stevens, one down towards Bellevue. This is a major collision, and you're trying to do it in rush hour with 15 witnesses that you're trying to gather. And it was just like, I am so glad I'm going to Eastern Washington. Western Washington, for me, was very reactive. I wanted more proactive work. I wanted to go out and dig stuff up. I wanted to get into the criminal stuff a little bit more than just responding to traffic calls.
Okay, so that was the question I was going to ask you. When you were in Everett, were you pretty much only doing traffic stuff then?
Absolutely. I mean, at the few times that we got to venture outside of traffic, it was, the county would come and take it over, or just because there were so many officers up there.
Yeah.
It was just different. You're working in a metropolitan area on a 20 shifts. If I didn't get 20 DUIs, I wasn't doing my job. There were so many drunks, so many things going on. It was a busy place.
How does it work? Is it just you as the sole WSP trooper at the time?
No, we would have a detachment, and there would be 6 or 7 people in that detachment, and the detachments would rotate responsibility. So there'd be 6 of us working in South End because there were that many calls for service. Okay. And then there would be 2 or 3 of those people working in the North Beat, and then we had a complete different detachment on the East Beat that went up to Stevens Pass to the Cascade Mountains.
Okay. So I want to ask you the same question that I've asked a couple of the other troopers. When obviously you're going to do something different in Eastern Washington, but when you start off and you're in Everett, how's the mentality of knowing that basically your primary job, obviously besides helping people that are in crashes and stuff, is, and DUIs I think are a little bit different, but when you're pulling people over and giving them bad news, for lack of a better term, you're just going to give them a ticket. How is that, especially as a 22-year-old?
The philosophy was different at that time for the State Patrol. The philosophy that I was taught by my field training officers and the instructors when I went through the academy is you take the least amount of enforcement to gain compliance. So, you don't hang paper or give somebody a ticket if you're going to chew their butt, right? So if you're giving them a ticket, that's enough. Don't chew their butt. If you're not going to give them a ticket, you can have an education with them and have an opportunity to try to convince them to do the right things. And society was a little bit different. I mean, there were times that you did write tickets, but I wrote a lot less tickets then than a lot of the younger generation. It's always been that way. There's those guys that write everybody they stop. I was more of the person that would like to sit and talk with the individual, educate them. I can remember having a woman that had her baby in the front seat with no seatbelt, no child restraint, and I had just covered an accident where a woman was holding a child in the front seat. She was seatbelted, the child was not, and the child was extruded through the front windshield as the crash came on, and it killed the child. So I just had that, and I was able to talk to this woman and say, look, this just happened to me. Please put a seatbelt on this child. It actually brought me a little bit to tears at the time. I didn't need to write that woman a ticket. She felt it to her very core, and she understood I wasn't out there nitpicking. I was trying to keep somebody safe and trying to use experiences that I'd had to help educate her. And I gained compliance without writing a ticket to that person. And then, I'm in a marked car, and a 16-year-old that's had his license 5 days passes me, and I'm 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. I stop him, and I'm thinking, his speedometer's got to be wrong. And I say, hey, buddy, did you see me? I'm in a marked car. I'm going 5 over, and you passed me. He goes, yeah, so what? Oh, you're getting a ticket. Because, a warning's not going to gain compliance. Yeah. So that was the philosophy then. I didn't have any problem with enforcing the law when somebody deserved to have the law enforced.
Let me ask you this. I've had interaction with troopers on the road in multiple states. I've always found agencies to be a little bit different. So, like, for example, I always found Oregon troopers, it didn't matter. They were always harsh. I'm going to just use that word. Do you think that philosophy, is that an individual philosophy? Do you guys have a mandate that comes down from the head of Washington State Patrol or Oregon State troopers, or are you given a little bit of freedom out there to use your own judgment, especially with Washington State Patrol?
In general, when I first came on, there was a lot of discretion. Supervisors would obviously make sure you're doing your work, but there was a lot of discretion. We were told that they want us to make 10 contacts with the public a day to be doing your job, whether that be a collision, assisting a disabled motorist, stopping somebody who's speeding. And they would emphasize, here's your fatalities. Here's what causes the fatalities. Let's focus on what is causing the fatalities: speed, DUI, seatbelt, that type of thing. So they would emphasize that. And then new supervisors or different supervisors would want you to do it their way. And like you said, each officer is different. Each officer is wired different. I've FTO'd a lot of people. I've trained a lot of people. Everybody's a little different. And that's what actually brings true strength in an agency, is don't try to make everybody a cookie cutter. I enjoyed doing commercial vehicle inspections and stopping trucks and then checking their brake travel and all in their logbooks, whereas other people in my detachment did not. I enjoyed doing DUIs, but I didn't like doing hit and runs. So there was somebody else that really enjoyed doing hit and runs, so we would share it, and some supervisors would allow you to be diverse that way. Others would say, no, you all have to do the same amount of everything. So it's varied, but the philosophy of the patrol at that time was officer discretion. We did have a new chief come in at one point in the early 2000s that said, no, you will get bomb, 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 because that's what is expected of you. And then people were being evaluated for it in certain ways. You didn't get enough seatbelt tickets this month or whatever it is. So I've seen that swing depending on who's in charge. And it's just interesting because my philosophy, especially going to Eastern Washington, I had more time. I got a lot of drug arrests.
So let's talk about that. So now you get transferred to Eastern Washington. What area in Eastern Washington?
I was assigned in Ellensburg, but I had all the way up to Snoqualmie Pass to Vantage, the top of Blewett Pass to Yakima. So a huge chunk of Central Washington.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what you said, reactive versus proactive. Because you weren't, I don't want to say as busy, because obviously you're staying busy. What did you try and focus on in Eastern Washington?
Well, I got to tell you, the day I had a 1985 LTD as my first patrol car, and it was a piece of junk. It scared me. The brakes would completely fade. I can remember coming to an intersection and having my foot hitting the floor, and I had no brakes, and I'm running code. So my lights are on. I'm coming up to a red light. I had to actually activate the emergency brake and slide into the intersection because I had no regular brakes. But I'm driving this car. It was cool because the day I left Everett, just totally reactive, always busy, I drove down to Olympia and got a brand new 1990 Chevy Caprice. So I drove from Everett all the way to Olympia, which is an hour and a half, 2 hours. And I never went 3 or 4, probably 4 miles an hour over the speed limit at the most. And anybody tried to pass me, I'd get on the PA and say, unless you want a ticket, slow down. So I looked like the pace car in the Indianapolis 500 going down I-5. And that was my way to say goodbye to Western Washington. I didn't write anybody tickets, but I had them go slow. And then I get a brand new patrol car. And I had to tell you the context, so this next part will make sense. I got this 1990 Chevy Caprice, which is an amazing, beautiful patrol car, completely different design. I go up, it's got a new Motorola radio. It's actually the new fancy ones on the dash. It's not the push button on the floor. So I wasn't super familiar. They had trained me a little bit. Driving over the pass, I drive all the way over Snoqualmie Pass, almost to Everett, and I had not heard one traffic or call for request. Not one call for service, not one collision, not one hit and run. I actually statused radio to see if my radio was working. My first 4 months, I got there in June. My first 4 months, I had 4 calls for service.
Wow.
And I was stopping 20 to 25 cars a day. And I was making drug arrests. I was able to follow up on my collisions because I was a collision tech. I just had an absolute ball. I thrived in the opportunity to be proactive. Whereas one of my buddies, who I graduated with, transferred over. He only stayed for 6 months and he went back to Everett because he didn't like proactive, he liked reactive. So it's just very different on the individual.
Yeah, interesting. So during your career, as you're working with WSP, you start to get involved in training. And actually, that's one way I was recommended to chat with you was Don Gula and Tracy Bastarche, who are previous interviews. They got involved in this program called A Wrestling, not wrestling, but A Wrestling. So I looked at your bio and your resume, and basically, there's a lot of stuff that you were teaching WSP troopers. Can you tell me how you got involved in that and what you were doing?
Absolutely. I told you about all the different stepdads. Well, my stepmom came from Hong Kong when I was 6 years old, spoke nothing but Chinese. This was in the 70s when Bruce Lee was really big. My stepbrother came over, and I got into martial arts at the age of 10. And I was in martial arts in and out my entire life. Just absolutely loved it. For whatever reason, that was an anchor for me during all of those moves and stuff. And because when you're the new guy in the school, you're going to get into a fight, at least as a boy, right?
Yeah.
The bully picks on you. So I had a routine. The bully would pick on me. I'd find out who the bully was and I'd take him on. And then I was accepted and I was good to go. And we became buddies. You know, that's just the way boys did it at that time. And we didn't even get us suspended. Imagine that. We worked it out. But so martial arts, and I had a fascination with it. And of course, having that Chinese culture in my family as well drove me that direction as well. So got involved in martial arts, did it as well in the military. I would train with people that I got a hold of from different areas that had different types of martial arts, and I was really intrigued with that. I wrestled in school because I just enjoyed the training aspect of fighting. Then when I ended up taking a transfer to the academy, because I'd done combatives in the military as well, I finished off, got my black belt in one particular art, and started training up at the Criminal Justice Training Center where Don Gula was. And we got introduced, and I got involved in his system called wrestling. And the beautiful thing about a wrestling was it wasn't martial arts in a gi, it was martial arts in full uniform where I'm having to protect my gun. I mean, it was very, very practical. It wasn't the art, it was martial, right?
Yeah.
There's no katas, there's no things that you have to do for the art and the tradition. It was more of, this is what you're dealing with on the street. Here's how you're dressed. And that's what I was actually assigned to do when I was recruited over to the academy. I was a drill sergeant in the reserves. I was a drill sergeant at Fort Dix, Fort Benning, Fort Jackson, and Fort Sill. My unit would go in and we would take 3 weeks and relieve the active duty drill sergeants on those basic training posts so they would get a break, and we would train the recruits, and then we'd come back and we trained all year just for that 3-week piece as reservists. So as a drill sergeant, was an interesting thing because it was very different from my personality. I was pretty intense, but I didn't like yelling at people. I didn't like that type of environment. But my first time in Fort Dix, it was right when Desert Storm was starting to kick off. And I had an E5. I was an E5, but he was a more senior drill sergeant. And we just got to Fort Dix, and this was the last basic training that went through Fort Dix before it became a prison, because the military gave it over to the federal prison system. And this kid walks by, and he's obviously in crutches. He's broken his leg during training, and he doesn't address us properly as drill sergeants, and he doesn't come to the proper parade rest, which he's supposed to. And the drill sergeant that's with me just reams him. I mean, he just tore this kid up. And I'm thinking, what an ass. I walk away, and I'm like, hey, Jim, what are you doing? And he goes, look, this guy's going to go to combat. We're at Desert Storm. He's going to go to combat. And if he doesn't respond to orders and do the right thing because he's lazy, somebody's going to die. And I went, oh, so you mean that intensity has a purpose and it may save lives. And all of a sudden, I became a good ass. I did okay at it because it had a purpose for me. And I was very intense because I knew that maybe this training, and if they could deal with it in training environments, maybe it'll save their life, because I knew the experience I'd had in the Marine Corps and different things that helped me, especially in crisis in law enforcement. You fall back on your training. So that became really important, which allowed me to now have that intensity edge to myself and the ability to really demand things from people in training. And my captain at that time, when I was working in Ellensburg, saw that, and he transferred and became the academy commander over in the Shelton area. And there was some issues with discipline in the State Patrol Academy at that time. I won't go into the details about that, but he recruited me to come over to bring that discipline back. So while I was a troop the last 4 years in Eastern Washington, the captain would have me come over for 2 weeks at a time and tune up the class and introduce military model to them. And I got known as Spurling because I would trash their rooms. I would demand perfection. Because if you can't make a bed, how are you going to survive and have things in your car where you need to have it in a crisis? How are you going to keep your gun clean? So I was very, very strict, but I was also very fair. I've had a lot of people over the years who said that my voice will still scare them because I had a big voice. But they also said, you saved my life multiple times, because when I was in the crisis, I could hear your voice saying, I will not quit, I will not die, I will survive, and some of the training that we did. So it helped me to learn how to become a trainer. And the martial arts was all part of that, because when I got pulled over to the academy, I started off as a firearms instructor and attack officer, and then they moved me, because it fit me, into the martial arts or the defensive tactics part. And I had the greatest job in the world. They sent me all over the world to train with the best fighters in the world so that I could distill that and bring it to our officers and keep them safe. It was absolutely the best job in the world.
Wow, that's really cool. You got to travel to do that.
And that's how I met Don.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that you were just teaching or instructing troopers at the time, or were you dealing with other people in the state of Washington, other law enforcement officers in Washington?
We were responsible for every cadet class and for in-service. So every trooper in the state would come back to the academy at that time, at the beginning for a week and then down for 3 days. But they would get training. And then I started branching out, and I got certified through the Criminal Justice Training Center as a master defensive tactics instructor, and started teaching with the Criminal Justice Training Center. And I also got involved with Don with the wrestling and all of the training things. So, and I was teaching in a martial arts studio as well.
Okay, so let's talk about your transition. So you become a chief criminal in the North Precinct for Mason County in 2013. So basically, you correct me if I'm wrong, you retire after 25 years with the Washington State Patrol in 2013.
Yes.
And instead of going golfing and fishing, you decide to do something else. Why continue on?
I had just retired from the military in 2005 after being activated for the war. I was a sergeant major out at Fort Lewis. I had that retirement. 2013, I was still only 48 years old. I knew I'd had lots of options. My wife and I wrestled over this a lot. I've been already at that point carrying a gun for 29 years in the military and in law enforcement. Thought about doing something different. I had gone back to college. I started my master's degree in theology. I had even considered becoming a pastor. Looked at lots of different options, but it all came down to making a choice. And I chose to stay in law enforcement because of the circumstances. And I really felt like that was the direction God was leading my wife and I. So I stayed in law enforcement. It was funny because within the first couple months, I was a chief criminal deputy in the North Precinct. And you're coming from the state patrol into the sheriff's office, and you have a lot of things to overcome because, the trooper, are you bringing your bow tie? Are you bringing your the state patrol way? Because there's a distinct difference between what a trooper does, what a deputy does, and what a city officer does. And then again, it's all the same. It's just like different positions on a football team. You're all football players, but you have different responsibilities. So the job of a sheriff was very different. And so there's a lot of, what's this guy going to be like? Is he going to try to force us to all be troopers? Are we all going to be stopping cars now and doing all this stuff? But I went to the North Precinct, and within the first couple months, I wanted to go and see one of my graveyard sergeants, make sure how she was doing, because I hadn't had a chance to see her. So I get up at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I get in my patrol car, and I drive around a neighborhood where close to where I live. It was November and nasty and dark and foggy Washington weather. And I'm driving around and I'm looking. I know the neighborhood. I know what's supposed to be there. I'm familiar with it. And this overwhelming sense of, yeah, this is what you were born to do. You're not done doing this yet. You were made to protect people. And woe is me if I don't do that. And at that point, it confirmed that, yeah, this is what you're supposed to be doing. I wouldn't be truly happy if I wasn't serving the community that way. So that's confirmed it for me, and got to the sheriff's office and absolutely loved it. Where the state patrol was when I retired, I was disappointed with where they had gone. They were no longer involved in the communities. There had been some lawsuits that you were gifting the state resources to the community. So the State Patrol was pulling away from parades, pulling away from schools. They had done away with their safety education program, which was basically the school resource officers. They had done away with the Explorer program. They just weren't involved in the community. And I hated that piece of the State Patrol. And in Eastern Washington, that wasn't the case. Because there was kind of like two state patrols, the Western Washington populated area that's being observed highly, in the Eastern Washington because you didn't have a choice in Eastern Washington. There'd be one trooper, one deputy, and one city officer working. You worked together. I did building searches. The sheriff of Kittitas County now, he and I did building searches together when we were young, so you didn't have a choice. But I watched the State Patrol do that. So I was really excited to get involved in the sheriff's office, because the sheriff is the only elected law enforcement official in the world. And when the community elects you, there's no rules that tell you can't get involved in the community that elects you. So the rules of engagement were very different for me. And I can still remember I coached high school football, and the sheriff told me, look, I want you to coach a little bit on work time. And I said, what do you mean? I can't do that. And he goes, those are my kids, and they know who you work for. You're going to be influencing them to stay out of trouble because you work for the sheriff's office and you're involved with them and you're investing in them, and that may influence their decisions in the future. I still couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to coach on work time, but it was a slow change of mind that I work for the community.
How did you get recruited to Mason County, or there was a position that was open? How did you end up here?
Well, I'd known the sheriff, and this is where I was working, and this was community I'd lived in. I've been very involved in the community, everything from coaching sports to 4-H to church to you name it. I was involved in it in the community, and I knew the sheriff. And the odd part of it was I knew the undersheriff very well, because he and I played football against each other in high school. And my wife went to school with he and his wife. And we'd known each other. He was a Marine Corps officer. I was a Marine Corps enlisted. We had those connections. And then I was coaching with him. I coached his son. And through those connections, when he found out I was retiring, he's the one that kind of recruited me to come to the sheriff's office.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about before we started recording, and you touched on it a little bit, but tell me how you go from Washington State Patrol, where you have a very defined group of things that you're working on, to a sheriff's office where you have a whole different plethora of stuff, and especially when you're over different groups. And I'm assuming that you have detectives, and I'm just throwing it out there, homicide, sexual assault, burglary, property crime, stuff like that, which I'm assuming you don't or never had to deal with Washington State Patrol. What was the learning curve like, and how did you figure it all out?
That's interesting. As a chief here, I come to the sheriff's office, lead the state patrol. I've been a collision tech for almost 20 years. So I'm investigating vehicular homicides on a scene that is movable and people want it cleared off. It's a highway, right? So you don't have a house. And I'm driving somewhere and I get flagged in my patrol car, and my guys are all busy, and it was a burglary, a fresh burglary that had just happened. And I'm going, I've never investigated a burglary. I've learned it in class, but I've never actually investigated it. And I thought, I better call. No, my guys are all busy. Man, how hard can it be? I went in and it was like, this is so easy. And what I mean by that is there's nuances. But investigation is investigation is investigation. And if you're a good investigator, it crosses over. You just have to learn how to apply it to a different context. So it was actually encouraging to me that there wasn't that big a difference, because if you're a good cop, you're a good cop and you're a good investigator. If you make a traffic stop and you're a good investigator and you get consent to search and you end up getting in and you get a drug dealer that has possession with intent to deliver and you do a good job investigating and interviewing, that same skill set applies as any kind of law enforcement, whether it be federal, city, it doesn't matter. So I found that very quickly that the commonalities were stronger than the differences.
Okay. So you essentially work from 2013 until 2023 as a chief deputy, but you get elected sheriff in 2023. Was there always a goal to be the sheriff?
No. I suspect when I was recruited, that was part of the thought process, that it may be potential, because I'm a very outgoing person.
Okay.
I teach a lot, been very involved in the community. I suspect that that may have been a thought, but whether it was or not, it didn't really develop until I'd been here for a while. And then I ended up getting moved from the North Precinct, and they put me as an interim jail chief. I can still remember that conversation. I'd come back from Hawaii, and all the other chiefs and command staff are kind of like avoiding eye contact with me. And the sheriff calls me into his office, and the undersheriff, and it's almost like I can see them following to come up and listen at the door. And the sheriff says, "Hey, I want to move you from being the North Precinct chief to being an interim jail chief." And Sheriff, I don't know anything about a jail. I'm a dumb trooper. What do I know about running a jail? And he goes, I don't want you because you know about jail. I want you to bring your leadership training, and I want you to change the culture in our jail. So he put me in the jail, and then after that, I got moved when we hired a full-time jail chief to investigations. And I realize now that because I didn't grow up in the sheriff's office, he was putting me in charge of different divisions so that I would have an understanding of every aspect of the sheriff's office, because his philosophy has always been, and it is my philosophy now, and I got to give kudos to Sheriff Casey Salisbury, the longest serving sheriff in the history of Mason County since 1854. He was the only 4-term sheriff and dearly beloved, and he still lives in our community. And I just went and talked to him yesterday. He's still a confidant and a mentor. But he was preparing me so that I would have the groundwork if I wanted to run for sheriff. And it was hugely beneficial to me. I still have the picture, because the funny part of it is when they told me I was going to take over the jail, I had sent them a picture of myself jumping off of some cliff in Hawaii that day. Just sharing with the undersheriff, because we're kind of buddies, and I'm 40 or 50 feet out jumping into the water. And when he came in, he says, "The day you sent me that picture is the day we were talking." And I said, "He has no idea what he's jumping into." But I do have to tell you that the jail was a great experience for me, but it was probably the most stressful 6 months of my entire 36 years in law enforcement, because it was so outside of my knowledge base. And I had to rely upon the experts in there within the jail. And we ended up going through about 5, I think we had 5 people we fired, had to make some changes in culture. And it was a growth experience for me.
Why'd they get fired, just out of curiosity?
Investigations,
Okay.
they needed to be fired.
Okay. So I'm curious. So I'm assuming you have to be elected in the state of Washington to
Yes.
be a sheriff. How was that? I mean, you don't strike me as a very political kind of person, right? So how is that change of going out and, for lack of a better term, glad handing with the public and, hey, it's me. How was that? Tell me about that.
I'm an extrovert. That's just who I am. You could say I'm political, or what comes first? Was it the running for office that made me that way, or was I that way already? I was already that way. I love people. I just like people. I'm a verbal processor. I like to talk. And for some reason, people feel comfortable around me. So that benefited me greatly. when you have somebody vacating office after 16 years, oftentimes it can be pretty contentious. But nobody ran against me. I can't tell you exactly why, but I'm not politically oriented. And one thing I can tell you as a sheriff, I'm not going to get involved in politics except for law enforcement.
Yeah.
Why would anybody want to know what I think about things that I'm not trained in? I know law enforcement. That's where I'm going to stay.
Yeah.
And I'm very big proponent on knowing your lane. My lane is law enforcement. Can I influence other offices? Yes, I can. But this is my lane. And it's just like other offices, the county commissioners or whatever, the auditor. They have their lane. They can influence my lane, but don't drive in my lane and I won't drive in your lane, right? So that's my thought about politics. The only reason I'm a politician is because the sheriff is the only elected law enforcement official in the world. And I got to tell you, with history, I love history, and the office of sheriff is so important to our country. Because you think about it, there is no other law enforcement official in the world that answers directly to the citizens who elected him. There's none. Every other law enforcement official answers to a politician that's not law enforcement. So I answer directly to the citizens, and that's what appealed to me about being a sheriff.
That's interesting. I never thought about it that way, but you're right, because even like a chief of police is basically appointed, and at any point, say a mayor can go, "You're out."
Yep.
You only have the citizens. Those are the only people that can get you out.
Yep. And I answer directly to them, and I hold that very near and dear to my heart. The Constitution of the United States is a big document that drives everything that we do, and the Constitution of Washington State drives a lot of that. And the power rests on the people. And law enforcement, just like preachers and doctors, we got too much power and authority to not be held accountable. We have to be held accountable, because if we weren't, it'll draw the wrong people. If you give people power with no accountability, the wrong people come to that profession.
Yeah.
Right? So I've never been one that's opposed to police accountability. I think it's a good thing. I think preachers should be held accountable too, and I think doctors, because they just got too much power if they're not held accountable. And the sheriff is directly accountable to the citizens. I don't have to worry about what a mayor thinks and what a city council thinks. I don't have to worry about what the governor, because the chief of state patrol could be fired tomorrow by the governor. I don't have to worry about, in federal agencies, what their elected official bosses think. I have to worry about what my citizens want and think, and what the laws and the Constitution say. And then I consider everybody else, because we're partners, right? And
Yeah.
I can get a lot more done in partnership with everybody than in opposition. So I have to find that balance, but I answer to the citizen. That's why I'm out in the community all the time.
Yeah.
My job is relationships and resources. My undersheriff runs the agency.
So let's talk a little bit about your leadership style. If I was to go to, you're not like a 500-man department, right? So if I was to go and talk to your chief deputy or one of your deputies just doing patrol, how do you think they would describe your leadership style?
Well, you're going to have to talk to them, obviously, but I hope they say it's very collaborative, because I surround myself with people that are smarter than me, that think differently than me. I don't want like-minded people, because then you get groupthink, and then you end up going the wrong direction, and nobody's willing to say, "Hey, stupid, did you think about this?" And I'm very open to that, or at least in my mind. I hope I'm open in their minds to that. But I have an undersheriff and I have chiefs that call me out on things all the time. "Hey, have you considered this before you make that decision?" They understand it's my name, because I answer directly to the citizens. They don't. So it's my name on the office. But they also understand I can't do it without them. Yeah. We have 102 people in our agency. We're right on the verge of being bigger, small, big, but we're not small. We're right in that medium range. So I can't possibly be everywhere and do everything, and I'm not smart enough, nor do I have the desire to try to run every division. I got the right people in the right places for the right reasons. And the most important thing is, just like what's on this badge here, is our core values. I can trust every single one of my appointed chiefs. I trust them fully. When they tell me something, I stop and I listen. Very rarely will I completely override what they say, unless there's some consideration that they're not privy to. But I highly respect what they have to say.
So let's talk a little bit about recruiting and hiring process here. I'm sure you, like everybody else, is feeling the latest thoughts that are going across America. So tell me what kind of deputy you're looking for here.
It's right on that badge, those core values. I told my people, and for 5 years before I became sheriff, I was pretty much doing all the hiring for the patrol division. It's that important to me. Even as a chief criminal deputy, I was involved with the interviews. I read every background. I've read every psychological, every polygraph, and I will not even come close to hiring somebody that doesn't have the character that we want. Character is the most important thing. We can train skills, but I can't train character. I may be able to help with character through lessons and that type of thing, but I need a base, good, solid character, because that person goes out and has crazy amount of authority to take somebody's citizenry, take their freedom away. That's a big deal. And I have to be able to trust them when I was a chief to be able to represent the sheriff's thoughts and concerns. And now as a sheriff, I have to be able to trust them to handle that very well, because what they take away from a citizen when they arrest them or are involved in some investigation and how they deal with that citizen is very important to me, because they work for that citizen. And public trust is very fragile, and we can destroy it very quickly if we do the wrong things.
Do you see any struggle here in Mason County with the quality of people that are applying for deputy positions here?
We saw a big decrease in the number of people that wanted to be in law enforcement. We saw a big increase in retirements. Give you an example. Of my 50 commissioned deputies, 25 of them have less than 5 years on.
Wow.
Over half of my agency is brand new. So that gives you an idea of what has happened in Washington State from COVID to the legislative laws that came in 2021, and the charges against 3 Tacoma officers for homicide. It's affected Washington State greatly. So in the anti-police rhetoric that's been put out in the media and other places, for goodness sake, you taking Paw Patrol, my grandson's favorite cartoon, off of the air because cops are bad and evil. It changed our business. When I was elected, there were 14 new sheriffs. That means citizens were changing who they wanted in charge, or people were retiring. So we lost the amount of people that wanted to be law enforcement. But it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because if somebody is applying to be in law enforcement when it's popular to be against law enforcement, they're probably doing it for the right reasons. So I didn't see the quality drop, but I saw the numbers drop, at least in this agency. We weren't paying as well as the surrounding counties, so you can go 20 miles and get $1,000 more a month to be in an agency somewhere else. But the quality of living, the community support, and the culture of the agency is what draws people.
So before I ask you kind of the last couple questions that I always ask, let's talk a little bit about not Washington State politics, because that's not what I want to ask.
That's a tricky topic.
That's a tricky topic, right? But we did talk a little bit about this beforehand, but you had mentioned, I think it was 2021. Basically, there's this issue that happens in Tacoma with some officers that get charged. And as a result of that case, the Washington State legislature starts passing, for lack of a better term, in my mind, kind of some anti-law enforcement things. But those result in things like the pursuit policy recently in the state of Washington. For the audience that don't know, there's a lot of instances where people are driving down the road, cops are in back of them trying to pull over, and you got bad guys on the phone going, hey, they're calling 911, hey, I know the pursuit policy, you got to tell this guy to stop chasing me, which is just crazy to me. So can you tell me some of the things that the legislature has done that hopefully, maybe they're working on and revising and realizing that these things aren't such a smart thing when they were passing in the heat of the moment that hopefully get changed a little bit.
Absolutely. I'm going to give you a little context before I answer
Yeah.
that directly.
Yep.
It would be ideal if society didn't need law enforcement. Isn't that the ideal?
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, human nature and the history of mankind says that men are selfish, self-centered, and they're going to do crazy things to get what they want regardless. What makes a society? What makes it civil? Laws and the enforcement of those laws. So even though it'd be nice not to have to need cops, we need them. The legislature, I believe, I hope, I'm going to make this assumption, may be crazy, but I assume that they were looking to try to make things better and assuming the goodwill of mankind that if we take some of these restraints off of them, they'll make the right decisions. But you took away the only real safety net and there was nothing underneath it. They said, yeah, we believe that, okay, you can no longer, one of the laws that was passed is you could no longer contact somebody that's in a mental crisis with reasonable suspicion. You have to have probable cause that they've done a crime. And you can't involuntary treatment act them and use force on them until you have probable cause. That was just an example. So what happened in our communities? People that are threatening people or that were being very crazy, we couldn't do anything until they actually hurt somebody. So although the intent may have been good, it wasn't really looked into. It seems like it was a little reactive. Are pursuits dangerous? No question. I've been in pursuits. I was 25 years in the State Patrol. I've been in pursuits. I've had crazy pursuits. Pursuits are dangerous. You always, and law enforcement has always, because I don't know what people think about this, but when I get up in the morning, put on my uniform, and I go to work, the absolute last thing I would ever want to have happen is that I'm stopping somebody for failure to signal. They run, now I've got a felony eluding, and I chase them and they hit a family head on in my community and kill them for a violation of failure to signal. Do I know that the felony of felony eluding at that point was a felony? Yes, but if that's all I have, does the risk of the pursuit outweigh the fact that this person's free? We've always had to go through that mental process. I've called pursuits off because the risk wasn't worth it. And I know that my family is driving a car and I don't want them to be hurt or killed. And I'm in a community where I know a lot of people. So yes, pursuits are dangerous. But officers have always been held responsible of whether we keep the pursuit going, and supervisors have to evaluate whether the risk of this person's freedom is greater than the risk that the pursuit causes. It goes all the way back to the Tennessee versus Garner case in the 70s. Does the person's freedom pose a significant threat of death or serious injury to others? And if they do, then you can take more aggressive action. But the pursuit laws really weren't thought through. And then when I hear the legislator who actually introduced the bill address Chelan County when they had the individual in a yellow dress steal a school bus and drive away, and they didn't have any of the violent crimes that were identified that allow us to pursue, so they had to let that bus go. And the person in an interview who introduced that bill said, well, they were obviously DUI, and you should have arrested them for DUI because that was the one clause that they put in there. Is it was you can only pursue with these violent crimes or you have reasonable suspicion for DUI. Well, the officers didn't have reasonable suspicion for DUI, and they aren't going to fabricate it. And it was like that legislator was telling us, well, you should have fabricated it, and that would have made it okay. Cops are rule followers. We've always had the option of being sued by the citizens in a civil suit, and I don't know many cops who haven't been sued. We've always had the scrutiny of policy and procedures of our agency that we have to answer to. We've always had the possibility of being charged criminally if we do something criminal. Now, though, we have decertification, we have all these other things that they've imposed, thinking that cops just deliberately push the limits and try. I've been doing this a long time. Those cops don't last. Do we get them? Yes, we do. Just like any profession. But you name another profession that has to go, at least in Washington State, through a polygraph, a psychological evaluation, extensive background. I don't even know any doctors that have to go through a polygraph. We got to go through all that before we get hired. So we do a really good job screening. So for the most part, we don't get the too many bad apples. Do people become corrupt in law enforcement is a question I've been asked. You look at Rampart down in the 90s in Los Angeles, where the end justifies the means. That's up to leadership to control that. And that is to make sure people understand we have one role in the criminal justice system and to stay inside that role. And if you don't feel that the people that are truly criminals are being prosecuted, well, then go and influence those lanes, but stay out of those lanes and don't try to be the juror and everything else out on the street. And those people don't last, at least in our state. And I've been around a lot of law enforcement, and I don't see people that wake up in the morning and say, I hope I get to shoot somebody today, or I hope I get involved in use of force. Like I said, there may be those people out there. I just haven't experienced too many of them, and they don't last.
Okay. Two last questions for you, Ryan. Did being in law enforcement affect your family?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, I've been married for 40 years. My oldest daughter and my son, they still talk about me leaving for work and them being worried whether I'd come home when they'd hear on the news that law enforcement officer was shot or killed. Or, I was on Snoqualmie Pass. I had a super exciting, I wish that we had video cameras back then. This was in 1993. I was on Snoqualmie Pass. I got hit 3 times, my body, not my car, by other cars on the pass in accidents. In one particular time I was hit, I went through a window, a car, a pickup truck, and a trailer full of snowmobiles all went underneath me while I was flipping in the air. And I landed so hard on the ground that it bent the frame of my gun, my semi-automatic weapon, in the holster. Fortunately, I was young and I was in great shape, and I just had whiplash and some cuts from the glass. But what an exciting thing. But, they have to grow up knowing, I hope Dad's coming back. So it does affect them. My youngest daughter probably followed in our footsteps, my footsteps more than anybody. She ended up joining the Marine Corps, becoming a Marine Corps officer, and she's now a deputy in her final stages of FTO. And that really kind of set me back as my daughter's going to become a law enforcement officer and get exposed to what I've been exposed to. I mean, in law enforcement, you get to see evil. A lot of citizens don't get to see evil, and some don't even believe that evil exists. If you just give the guy a hug or the gal a hug, they'll be nice. That's not the reality. There are people out there that are evil, and I didn't know if I really wanted my daughter to see what I had seen and the carnage and the atrocities that I've seen that any law enforcement officer sees. But then I started thinking about it, and because I was responsible for all the hiring, I asked myself, would I hire her? Yeah, she's perfectly suited for this job. She was made for it. To survive in this career, you have to have a certain makeup. In law enforcement, we say it as FTOs, either they got it or they don't. Is that something you can articulate? What is it? I don't know if I can necessarily articulate it, put it all on paper, but when I see it in action, I know what it is. It's kind of like, was it Senator McLean said, I may not be able to describe pornography, but I know it when I see it, when he was referring to something. I know that my daughter has that ability, so I stopped fighting that process once I realized that. And in law enforcement, in order to survive, you have to have you just have to be that type of person that, and I encourage her, get involved in the community outside law enforcement. Be involved in other social groups. Because in law enforcement, especially when you first start and you get on graveyard and you're arresting all these bad guys and you're just intensely into it, you get so inundated with the part of society that nobody else sees that you begin to think that all citizens are pieces of garbage and that you don't want to be around them, and you get cynical. And fortunately for me, I had one family member when I was early on, about a year and a half in, and I was getting that cynical attitude back in the 80s. And my great aunt, my great uncle was the assistant chief in Cedar Woolley Police Department back in the 40s and 50s, and he'd passed away. But I went up to visit her, and she sat me down, and she heard the things I was saying, and she came and sat down and said, "Listen here, young officer, I'm going to give you a lesson. You have a choice to focus on the negative or focus on the good. And I tell you, if you focus on the good citizens in our community, it will eclipse or overshadow the negative portion of our community, and it will motivate you to take care of it in a different fashion." And that was a turning point for me. So I'm obviously working hard to help my daughter through that and other officers through that, because it is something that's real. And I had one of my deputies who worked graveyard for 5 years, just transferred to day shift, and very smart guy. He was an E6 in the Marine Corps in Iraq, Afghanistan. He's seen a lot of stuff. And I asked him, I said, "Well, what do you think of day shift?" And he goes, "Sheriff, it's really weird dealing with people that pay taxes." And I just lost it. I'm like, "Oh, that is an interesting perspective." He goes, "It's kind of nice." So there you go.
So that's interesting. You mentioned about your aunt.
Yes, my great aunt.
So that's my last question for you then. You're still in law enforcement, 25 years state patrol, you're now the sheriff. Has being in law enforcement affected the way that you see people?
Oh, absolutely. How could it not? But what life doesn't affect the way you see people? I mean, again, I don't have the capacity to do a lot of jobs, but I do to this. Carnage has never really bothered me. Some people, it bothers them greatly. The things that bother me that other people do, I wouldn't survive. The administrative portion, I'm okay at, but it stresses me out. I don't like it. I want to deal with people. So everybody's got gifting, and there's a diversity, a true diversity in each person. And in order to survive this career for a long time, you have to have that whatever it is, you have to be made for it. And I believe for me, it's an absolute calling. I love serving people. I love protecting people. I would at any point lay down my life for somebody else in a situation, because that's just who I am. Does that mean I'm better or worse than somebody? No, it doesn't. It just means that's the way that I am made.
Yeah. Sheriff, thank you very much for the interview.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate for all your help in law enforcement.